Opening the king's diagonal immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares piece development. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, this choice prepares a flexible approach to the ensuing middle game skirmishes. Securing the center and preparing for development, this knight leap signals an intent to control key squares ahead of black's pawn advances. Striking at the center immediately challenges white's pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move offers a flexible pawn structure for white's pieces to maneuver. Immediately opening lines grants tactical possibilities, but eases development for the opponent. Recapturing opens the diagonal for your bishop and claims central space, setting up a solid pawn structure. Forcing a queen exchange simplifies the position, often leading to an endgame where precise pawn play becomes paramount. Securing the king and initiating the endgame is the priority, opening lines for development. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies the center and prepares for further piece activity, but it does concede some tempo in the opening phase. Securing the knight on d2 stabilizes white's central presence, preparing to develop the bishop and potentially castle, all while keeping a keen eye on black's slightly exposed monarch. Developing the kingside fianchetto here intends to prepare the bishop to control the long diagonal, but it's a bit slow and concedes central influence as white already holds solid ground. Building a solid pawn chain across the center offers white excellent central control and prepares a comfortable development for the remaining pieces. Developing the bishop to g7 directly addresses the central tension by preparing to challenge white's seemingly dominant pawn structure and eyes the open diagonal towards the white king. Solidifying the center with f3 prepares for a kingside pawn advance, potentially creating a robust pawn chain that restricts black's piece mobility while also offering the king some breathing room from potential diagonal threats. Challenging the central pawn structure so early, f5 aggressively fights for space and opens lines, though it does create potential weaknesses around the king and may prematurely expose the dark-squared bishop's diagonal. Seizing the central pawn opens the e-file, directly challenging black's pawn structure while sacrificing a tempo. This aggressive pawn capture forces an immediate reaction and introduces early tactical complexities, potentially sacrificing material for initiative. It dramatically alters the board's geometry, creating a more open position where piece activity and control of the newly freed diagonal will become paramount. Black must carefully assess whether accepting the pawn leads to advantageous exchanges or uncovers critical weaknesses. Opening the g-file for your rook is a tactical gamble. The pawn structure now looks a bit ragged, potentially creating targets for white's pieces. But you've initiated a dynamic struggle, aiming to exploit any missteps in white's development with active piece play. Protecting the central pawn with the monarch, white solidifies their pawn structure and prepares to castle kingside, aiming for a more secure king position after the early queen exchange, and subsequently developing their pieces towards the center. Developing the knight to f6, black aims to restore some central influence and prepare for castling, while the knight also eyes the d5 square, potentially challenging white's pawn structure. This knight placement is a natural continuation, seeking to reintegrate pieces after the queen trade and signaling an intent to defend the king. Initiating a knight maneuver to the queen side, white aims to reinforce the b3 square and prepare for potential future central play by repositioning this piece. This knight's journey from d2 to b3 opens a subtle diagonal for the c1 bishop and hints at a desire to control more of the queenside territory. It's a move that speaks to patient development and a building of positional pressure, rather than an immediate tactical assault. Observe how this subtle shift in the knight's placement might influence black's pawn structure or create new avenues for white's rooks down the c-file should it become open. The knight's bold thrust into the center, nd5, immediately challenges white's knight on b3 and aims to disrupt the delicate pawn structure that white has been carefully constructing. This aggressive placement seeks to exploit the central void created by the queen trade, potentially creating attacking opportunities by pinning down pieces and forcing white to commit to defensive maneuvers. Black is not afraid of an exchange here. Instead, they see a chance to activate their pieces and gain a foothold in the core of the board, aiming to simplify the position in their favor and steer towards an endgame where their active knights might prove superior. Aiming to expand white's influence on the queen side, this pawn thrust subtly begins to restrict black's developing pieces, particularly the knight on d7, potentially opening the b1h7 diagonal for future rook operations once the pawn advances further. Bringing the knight to e5 immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to liberate the bishop on g7 by clearing the f6 square for future piece activity. This maneuver cleverly forces white to react to a direct threat, disrupting their potential king-side buildup and highlighting the awkward placement of the knight on b3. Aggressively centralizing, the knight now eyes the d5 square, potentially forcing another exchange that would simplify into a favorable endgame for white, or at the very least, gain significant tempo. Opening up the f-file so aggressively, while seemingly creating attacking chances, might inadvertently expose your king further down the line by weakening the pawn's shield, a crucial element for king's safety in the ensuing middle-game skirmish. Reclaiming central influence through knight repositioning, Na3 aims to sidestep the immediate pawn pressure on the queen side and prepare a more active role on the c2h7 diagonal, potentially supporting a future b4 push or defending against black's burgeoning kingside activity. Challenging the knight's dominion, this pawn thrust carves a diagonal for the bishop and aims to disrupt white's knight outpost, potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Unlocking the knight's potential, this maneuver finally brings a piece into a more active role, aiming to challenge black's encroaching pawn structure and potentially target the d5 outpost. Initiating castling locks down the monarch, a sensible precaution with the central pawn structure fractured, but it also surrenders any potential for aggressive pawn storms on the kingside and leaves the pawn chain on the kingside somewhat exposed to future knight incursions. Relocating the monarch from the exposed center to a potentially safer square on the queen side allows white to prepare for queenside expansion and centralize the king for future endgame skirmishes, though it does momentarily concede control of the b-file. The knight surges forward, aiming to disrupt white's cramped kingside and exploit the central pawn structure that has become a little too spread out. Black seeks to activate this piece by placing it on a square that not only pressures white's central pawns, but also aims to control key diagonals and files, potentially leading to tactical skirmishes or a more favorable pawn majority as the game progresses towards the endgame. Initiating development of the light-squared bishop aims to activate a dormant piece and challenge black's promising knight outpost, potentially freeing the d-file for future use and forcing a positional concession. Developing the bishop to e6 strategically positions it to potentially challenge white's control of the central light squares and offers a flexible defensive structure for black's kingside should white's knights become more aggressive. Challenging the enemy center pawn and aiming to gain a crucial tempo before black can consolidate their knight on d3. This move seeks to pry open lines while simultaneously preventing a potentially suffocating pawn advance. A bold assertion of influence in the center, this knight's advance to b4 is a calculated risk, immediately challenging white's newly established pawn chain and disrupting the previously quiet coordination. Unlocking the c3 bishop grants white's queenside pieces a much-needed pathway for development, simultaneously questioning the robustness of black's centralized knight and the security of its pawn structure. Unlocking the d-file for the rook marks a proactive attempt to challenge white's overextended kingside, aiming to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces and create dynamic play amidst the emerging pawn structure. Unleashing the rook to the semi-open g-file, white intends to exert pressure along this critical avenue, potentially targeting black's kingside or opening it further. The knight's audacious leap to e5 offers a fascinating double-edged proposition, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain by targeting the d3 pawn and potentially opening lines towards the king, while simultaneously inviting an immediate pawn push that could cripple black's kingside structure. Repositioning the rook to the open file aims to initiate a slow positional squeeze, but it neglects the immediate pressure black exerts on the kingside. The queen's retreat might seem prudent, but it allows black to solidify their central pawn structure and launch a more coordinated attack on white's somewhat exposed king. Consider the potential for piece activity. Black's pieces are becoming increasingly centralized and coordinated, while white's are still somewhat awkwardly placed. This rook maneuver, while seemingly active, might be a tempo loss if black can effectively exploit the gained initiative elsewhere. The king's current position, while not under immediate fire, lacks sufficient defensive pawn cover, a fact that black is clearly aware of and will likely seek to exploit as the game progresses. Asserting control over the central dark squares, the knight ventures to d3, aiming to disrupt white's developing harmony and potentially provoke weaknesses around the monarch. The rook's redeployment to the open d-file ignites a strategic battle for central influence, aiming to contest the valuable outpost black has subtly constructed. This maneuver signals a shift towards a more active, aggressive posture, recognizing that passive waiting has allowed black's pieces to develop a concerning degree of coordination and attacking potential. The white king, while still somewhat exposed, benefits from this active defense, drawing attention away from its own safety and onto the central contest. Observe how the rook's presence now discourages black's knight from further incursions on the d-file, potentially forcing a retreat or a positional concession. White is clearly seeking to disrupt black's harmonious setup and introduce complications that could lead to an advantage. Unlocking the d-file with the rook dramatically alters the queenside dynamic, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially activate the bishop. Sacrificing the bishop clears the path for your rooks to become active and seize the open d-file, creating significant pressure on black's position. Seizing the open file with a flourish, the rook charges forward, disrupting white's newly arranged pieces and forcing the king to abandon its relatively safe retreat. This maneuver attempts to dislodge the black knight and open lines for potential kingside activity, though it also exposes the white monarch to further pressure along the semi-open c-file. Recapturing with the bishop solidifies black's central control, offering a strong outpost for the piece on e5, and importantly, defending the crucial f6 square while also preparing to challenge white's misplaced knight on a3. Unleashing the rook to its heart's desire along the second rank, white sets the stage for potential breakthroughs while keeping an eye on black's exposed monarch. Seizing the open file for its rook, black forces white to commit its knight to a potentially awkward outpost, a bold maneuver that injects a dynamic surge of tactical possibilities into the position. Initiating a daring centralization for the rook, aiming to contest the open d-file and potentially disrupt black's newly established outpost on b2. Unleashing a daring knight raid, this piece spearheads into a highly active central square, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns. Probing the flank with that pawn push, white aims to disrupt black's queenside control and potentially open lines for his own pieces, forcing a decision from the opponent regarding that advanced knight. The knight's audacious leap to the queenside injects a potent tactical threat, aiming to disrupt white's kingside structure and potentially exploit the overloaded defenses around the monarch. The king, having found a temporary perch, now considers its strategic placement in the evolving pawn structure. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, aims to consolidate defensive resources and potentially reorient the monarch for a more active role should the central conflict resolve favorably for white. The black knight's unexpected detour to c2, a seemingly suicidal sacrifice, orchestrates a brutal geometric trap for white's king, completely disregarding the immediate material loss to create an inescapable mating net by forcing the king into a fatal corner. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside after a decisive check, this pawn push aims to disrupt black's knight outpost and reclaim queenside space, though it potentially weakens white's own structure in the process. The endgame has suddenly become sharp, with the capture of the rook opening up new tactical possibilities around the black king's immediate vicinity, and the queen's continued presence in the tactical fray. King, now exposed and somewhat isolated, ventures forward, a gamble to reignite attacking potential against black's consolidated pawn structure, while simultaneously accepting the immediate loss of material to gain activity. a crucial moment for unlocking the newly freed pawn majority on the queen's side. The king, once a sheltered monarch, now bravely ventures into the thick of the action, aiming to reclaim its kingly status by participating in the ensuing pawn skirmishes and potentially stabilizing the exposed queenside structure. Securing the rook's position on the open file immediately establishes a crucial advantage, preparing to dominate the vital 8th rank and apply relentless pressure on white's uncastled king. Pushing the pawn to g3 creates a new potential escape square for the king on g2, while simultaneously preparing to activate the kingside rook to the g file, aiming to challenge black's dominant rook. Prying open the kingside for potential infiltration, black's pawn push dramatically alters the defensive posture of white's monarch, creating new avenues for attack. Exploiting the recently opened vertical thoroughfare to bring the rook into an aggressive position, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. The bishop's retreat to f6 ignites a subtle positional battle, aiming to solidify the pawn chain and prepare for potential rook activity on the open, a file, while simultaneously eyeing the precarious white king's position. Finally, the knight finds a more active square, aiming to harass the opponent's pawns and potentially threaten the now exposed black king. The rook's relocation to the 1st rank immediately intensifies pressure along the open file, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around the king. Unleashing the rook from its semi-protective perch, white aims to challenge black's recently established dominance over the open file, forcing a confrontation that could reveal weaknesses in black's pawn structure. A powerful repositioning of the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's rook activity on the g-file and simultaneously establish an outpost for it on the now open diagonal towards white's kingside. The rook retreats, a tactical necessity to defend against the immediate threat of the bishop and knight combination, while subtly repositioning to potentially contest the open a file later, should the opportunity arise without undue risk. Securing the king's safety now becomes paramount, allowing for a more proactive approach to developing the rook's influence on the open files. Challenging the adversary's entrenched rook with a direct threat on the back rank forces a positional concession, aiming to disrupt black's well-coordinated pieces and potentially exploit the exposed king. Reactivating the bishop to its former glory on e6 offers a renewed avenue for peace cooperation, eyeing the d3 square once more and potentially creating discomfort for white's kingside structure. Initiating a subtle repositioning, the bishop advances to challenge black's control over the central light squares and prepares for potential future pawn pushes, aiming to solidify white's queenside structure. Expanding the queenside pawn structure with b5 aims to contest the open a file and potentially create space for black's pieces, though it also weakens the light squares around the king and opens lines for white's rooks if not adequately supported. Unleashing the rook to claim the open file, white aims to disrupt black's consolidated position and exploit the now weakened king's protection. A delightful tactic unfolds as the bishop swings across to deliver a check, exploiting the exposed white king and potentially disrupting white's newly consolidated pawn structure. Sacrificing the pawn with check is a desperate attempt to create a diversion, but it exposes the king to immediate danger. Black recaptures the rook, finally stabilizing the board after a chaotic sequence where pieces were exchanged with abandon. But the material imbalance now favors white, and the exposed black king remains a significant concern as the endgame looms. Sensing an opportunity after black's bishop has wandered out, white decisively claims the central pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for their rook. Pushing the b-pawn creates a passed pawn and threatens to dominate the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's weakened king position and secure a crucial advantage in the ensuing endgame. The bishop awakens, finally venturing from its passive confinement to support the pawn push and potentially open lines for a desperate counterattack against white's king. Bringing the bishop actively into the fray, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create potential mating threats along the kingside diagonal, while simultaneously securing the pawn on b4. Reclaiming the vital outpost with the knight, this squares the pieces and prepares for a potential recapture on the file, aiming to disrupt black's initiative. Asserting dominance on the queen side with the bishop now targets the open file, preparing to exploit potential weaknesses once the rook ventures forward. Activating the monarch to a more central and secure posting is paramount after the recent rook trade, preventing any premature kingside infiltration by black's bishops. That bishop now endeavors to find a secure outpost, potentially preparing to swing over to the kingside and lend support to its king, which remains exposed. Initiating a pawn storm to exploit the open king's side diagonal is the strategic aim, aiming to dislodge the opponent's pawn shield and create attacking opportunities. The bishop now retreats, seeking safety behind the pawn chain, a sensible decision given the aggressive forward positioning of white's rook and the potential for a discovered attack if it remained on the advanced square. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure is a logical step, aiming to deny black immediate attacking avenues and maintain a defensive barrier against the opposing bishop. Clearing the path for the king's ascent is a bold gambit, potentially opening new avenues for offensive action despite the inherent risks. Reasserting centralized knight control, this repositioning aims to anchor your knight in a more active central square and prepare for potential pawn advances or further piece development, offering flexibility and a renewed strategic presence on the board. Pushing that pawn forward dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating an immediate spatial advantage on the queen side and potentially opening lines for the remaining rook. Navigating the cramped queenside pawn structure, the knight repositions to create a defensive screen and eye potential advancements on the king side, aiming to bolster the defensive line against black's advancing pawns. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, this advance aims to create a decisive breakthrough on the queen side, forcing white to commit resources to its containment and potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces. Activating the knight to a broad square offers a new attacking avenue and prepares for potential pawn advances on the king side, aiming to dislodge the advanced black bishop. The pawn thrust on the dark squares unleashes a torrent of potential, aiming to sever white's coordination and forge a passed b-pawn with newfound impetus. The knight's journey to d3 aims to disrupt the pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn on the king side while forcing a pawn exchange. Opening the pathway to the kingside pawn storm is a bold gambit, aiming to dislodge that pesky knight and perhaps create new attacking avenues for the bishop. Unleashing the pawn to disrupt the pawn chain and create an escape square for the king feels like a desperate gamble to stir up complications in a rapidly deteriorating position. A king's journey to the center of the board, aiming to activate its presence amidst the developing pawn storm, but this particular forward march might be exposing it prematurely to the encroaching enemy knights and pawns.